Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Chats with Chels podcast. I'm your host, Chelsea Miller, and I am coming at you on a Sunday once again to share my weekly update and maybe get into some story time and whatever else comes into my mind throughout this talk today. So, thank you for being here. You can follow me on Instagram. I post updates on my story there, and I also post when these podcasts go live. So it's helpful to be there. And I am still on a mission to get people to ask me questions. So if you are curious about anything that I share today or any of my other podcasts, if you have listened to those, please ask because it helps me give you content that you want to hear. But I guess we'll start on Tuesday of this week because I filmed my last update on a Monday. The weekend got away from me, but not this time. Tuesday, I had a pretty chill day leading up to statistics, and I usually have statistics in the afternoon on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it seemed fine. We were kind of going over some code and concepts that we had already discussed prior to our first midterm. The code was just slightly different because we were working with 2 samples instead of 1. So I felt pretty comfortable with the material. I'm finding it more difficult to stay present in that class because of the bore, honestly. But just sometimes my professor uses words that don't compute in my head. And I don't like feeling lost the entire hour and 45 minutes that we are sitting in that class together. I'm working on it. On Wednesday, I went to class in the morning for nutrition, and I'm going to be honest, that class is just so dense with information. And I know my professor knows it, but I think he always comments on whether or not our eyes are glazing over in class, and he asks us if we need clarification on anything. But I've talked about this before. I think with how much information that's coming in is unfamiliar, it's really difficult to generate questions for him. It's just hard. So I find it increasingly more difficult to also be present in that class, not because it's boring, but because it's just so dense. I worked on some homework throughout the earlier parts of the week, and we have a lot of homework questions for this chapter of nutrition. And for those of you who haven't listened to my previous podcasts, we started with carbohydrates as a full-on chapter, and that's what our midterm number 1 was on. We have since transitioned to lipid metabolism, and that was a topic that was not covered in very much detail in my undergrad. I think we touched on it in biochemistry and in my advanced nutrition class back in my undergrad, but it's a lot more conceptual now. And the types of questions that my professor is trying to get us to answer are, where does this pathway start? What causes it to start? So what promotes the pathway? And what is the state of your body that is driving that? And then you have all of the enzymes that are involved in between. And yeah, it's really complicated. Maybe one of these days I'll film my podcast and have like screenshots of some of the slides that we use for that class, because one of the slide decks was 132 slides or something like that. It was wild. I also had a study date with one of my classmates, and now that I'm saying this out loud, I can't remember if that study date was last week or this week. I kind of stopped labeling these weeks like week 7 update, week 8 update, because they're all sort of blending together. I still think it's crazy that we're more than halfway through the semester now. And one of my classes is actually ending in a couple weeks, and it's the ethical conduct of research class, which is required by every grad student to take at Colorado State. And the content is really good. I think that ethics and research are at the forefront of ethical practices, obviously, but also just to get your mindset ready to do things in a way that are reproducible and are ethical, and you have a workflow that is easy for you to follow, but it enables us to communicate with other people around us more clearly and with expectations that have already been laid out for us. I talked about in an earlier episode of this podcast about how we had to do an individual development plan with our mentor. And that was a really great experience. I felt fortunate that my mentor already had an IDP in her lab, and I actually got to contribute to the reformatting of that because I came from a lab at San Diego State in my undergrad that already had an IDP, and they actually brought in undergrads into that process too. So I had been working with an IDP for 3 years prior to coming to CSU, and I got to contribute some more thoughtful questions that my mentor could ask us and just basically give more of a roadmap and include some things that she didn't have in there before. So I thought that was kind of cool. And the other points of this ethical conduct of research class include animal and human subject research, what goes into that process. I know for me, I'm more familiar with an IRB. It's a review board that you have to basically answer to when you are generating a new study for human subject research. But I also learned what the process would be for animal subject research too, which hopefully I won't have to work with because it's not my vibe. It's not my cup of tea. I don't plan to work with animals. Cells are great. Food is great. And human subject research is really awesome. I just personally will not be partaking in the animal subject research if I can help it, because that's just a realm that I don't care to be an expert in. But we can talk about that another time. I don't want to get into the politics of it right now because I am not a political person. Anyway, let's move on from that. So, other aspects of this class that I've found really helpful include data management. I didn't even know that there was a plan that you would follow for something like that. And I guess it didn't really occur to me how important saving and documenting your data, like in multiple folders, but also the way that you save the file and where matters a lot, especially when you're working with collaborators. And that was something that I didn't really have to worry about in my undergrad. So now that I'm on a project that has myself and my mentor and then 2 other collaborators and their grad students, I just see a really big need to follow a data management plan and communicate what that is going to look like for all of us involved. I am learning so much all at one time in all of my classes, and it's all starting to come together in a weird way. Even though I still feel lost in nutrition and I still feel lost in statistics, I feel like my day-to-day schedule is more solid now. I know what time I need to wake up to go to the gym and to get that in before I go to school. And it varies depending on whether or not I have a 9 a.m. class. So my weekly schedule, Monday and Tuesday are like my light days, and then Wednesday and Thursday I have class essentially all day, and it's not terrible. Thursdays are like the most busy day, and it's just the most draining day. And I guess that brings me to Thursday of this past week, where I had to give an introduction to a professor who came to talk to my grad student seminar class. And this man had a 10-page CV because he got his PhD in the 80s, and he has been actively in the research community, both in engineering and in health equity since then. And it was very hard to condense a 10-page CV and all of these accomplishments to a 2 to 3 minute introduction. I luckily found some sources online that had some form of bio for him. And so I kind of used those bios to drive the flow of my speech, which was really helpful. I think if I had tried to do an introduction like this prior to any of my experience in undergrad, I would have been freaking out. But I've gotten really used to talking to people, which is part of the reason why I wanted to start a podcast in the first place, because I really do enjoy having conversations about things and learning about people just as much as I like learning information. So it was a cool opportunity. I think it would have been a lot more helpful to know this person before I gave the introduction, because his CV doesn't really give context and the reason why he transitioned from engineering to health equity. And to me, listening to his presentation, that was like the most important aspect of his speech or his talk, but also his life path. And I felt really inspired at the end of his introduction and throughout his entire presentation. But I could see how the dots were not all connected while he was giving this presentation. And I think it's hard to do when you have so much experience and you transition and you only have 50 minutes to give a talk on something. But I was just talking about it with one of my other grad student colleagues, and for her, it wasn't as impactful because the way that he bridged the gap between engineering and health equity didn't quite translate. But I found it very impactful because I had read his entire CV and a couple of bios online about him before I went into that talk. So something I took away from that is background context is very important. And I think that being able to streamline a presentation, especially when it's about yourself and your experience, it really is a skill that not everyone possesses. And I would like to build on that skill as I progress in my program, because I also think that translates directly to how well you can teach people information that is unfamiliar to them. So I just thought it was a cool experience to sit there and listen to a man who has been in the research space for 3 decades. And what the work he's doing with health equity is trying to build a true representation of what the word health means and how that would translate to underserved populations, especially in Colorado. Fort Collins, more specifically, is what he's focusing on in the Native community here. And I could not help but think back to how I got into nutrition in the first place, because I think that's why it was so impactful for me. I have told this story about how I got interested in nutrition and how I adopted a plant-based diet. But at the root of all of that, it was because every single documentary, every single book, every single YouTube video that I would watch from these people, no one ever was able to truly define what the word health means. And a lot of times in the public space, when you're talking to the layperson on the street, whenever they hear the word health, it translates more to health care than it does to actual health of the person. And the most interesting aspect of this professor's presentation was how even the NIH doesn't have a definition of health, and they are the National Institute of Health. I just thought that was kind of wild. We have gone so far beyond making people healthy. And there's a whole multitude of driving factors for that. In my opinion, the most prominent one is you're not really able to make money off of other people being healthy. And he brought up his time that he was living in Switzerland and the way that the healthcare providers interact with their patients out there. And to me, it seemed like the demand for people to actually visit their healthcare practitioner was a lot lower than it would be here, because instead of driving disease, they're driving health, and they give incentives for people that live there to adopt a healthy lifestyle, to be more active, and to eat more diverse foods that would promote health instead of cause disease. And I know that's a very polarizing topic to talk about, is what foods are healthy and what is the impact on your health. But again, at the root of all of that, what the heck does health mean? And why is that not being prioritized on an individual level? When you go in the United States to visit your healthcare practitioner, it's because you have a problem, not because you want an annual checkup. And unfortunately, from my perspective, the money that's being made from large pharmaceutical companies and these partnerships that doctors and other healthcare practitioners benefit from, it's at the benefit of the practitioner or the benefit of the institution, and not the benefit of the person who's coming in to utilize those resources. So I think personally, being someone who is entering into the professional space of nutrition, that I have a really important role in communicating and trying to clarify what being healthy means from the aspect of nutrition. And I do think that based on my education in nutrition and dietetics, the people who are coming into the registered dietitian space and the people who are fighting for registered dietitians to have more of a say in a healthcare setting, I think that's the starting point for bridging that gap. Because we as nutrition professionals really do look at the individual person, or we should. I can't speak for every person in this space, but the people that I know personally, and myself included, are entering into the world of nutrition and dietetics to be better communicators to the people who need help, the people who need to change their lifestyle, the people who are on nutrition support because they can't feed themselves because of whatever other disease state they have going on. So to me, I think that the nutrition professionals have the most important role and are doing the hard part of communicating to their patients, individualizing their care, and doing their best to standardize that based on what sort of state the person comes in at or with. And it's just been a really inspiring week to reflect on my why for becoming a nutrition professional in the academic space, but also to hear and to have a conversation with people who I know are really close friends of mine and are currently going through their dietetic internships and learning what they need to learn to be great at their job, but also to build connections with the people who need the most help. And that really hit me yesterday when I had a conversation with my friend April, because hearing her talk so confidently about her ability to write a nutrition prescription for someone with a really complicated situation and know that her work is going to help this person, it's just been really cool to see. And I see it a lot in my other friends who are going through their internships too. You build this confidence as you go through. And the process to building that confidence is not linear at all. I think, especially for me being in my first semester of my PhD, I can only hope to get to that confidence level by the time I go to defend my work. But to see someone else pave the path of building that confidence after knowing where they started from and knowing that their starting point was very similar to my own in terms of like mental insecurity, it's a way to work forward. It's something to look up to. And I hope that I stay in this inspired state of mind, because it's a lot better. It's a lot more uplifting than to berate myself and tell myself, gosh, I'm dumb because I don't know this really complicated thing. And that was actually reinforced with a conversation that I had had with my mentor on Friday, which is bringing me to the end of the week. A long-winded way to get there. I have a chronic condition of talking a lot. So I guess this podcast format is a great space for me to be in. Anyway, I had a conversation with my mentor on Friday because myself and an undergrad in my lab were trying to start this in vitro digestion protocol. And at first, and the last 2 weeks when I've showed up to lab meeting, I've been hyper focused on this step that is emphasized in the protocol of pH adjustment. And when I see the words pH adjustment, my eyes glaze over. Like, I don't know what we're adjusting. We're adjusting pH, but like how? So I had read through the protocol. I had looked up what pH adjustment is. I read a paper about like different proteomics because I thought that maybe they were related just based on the language in my grants. And come to find out that pH adjustment is literally adding acid or base to the food product and waiting and taking measurements over time until you get the pH that your enzymes will function at. And when I look back on this, I'm like, gosh, that is really simple. But I can't know what I don't know. And that came up again on Friday because I had this idea in my head that we were going to start with 5 grams of sourdough in a tube, and we were going to add hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide until we got a pH of 3, because that's what the gastric enzymes run at or function at. And in my head, all that was in the tube were those 3 items. But after talking to the most brilliant undergrad I have access to right now, he is so great. Bo, if you're listening, you have such a bright future, and I am honored to work with you. And I wish that I thought the way that you did when I was younger, because it's really cool to see the question generation process based on things that he's taking in also. And okay, it's been really cool. So anyway, I was talking to him, and through that conversation, we had pulled up this table in this in vitro digestion that's like, here's a sample protocol. Here's a sample setup of your experiment. And here's suggested volumes that you should start with on everything. And in this table, there are 3 or 4 different like modes or steps to the process, because we are starting with an oral enzyme alpha amylase because we are mimicking human digestion. So where does digestion start? In your mouth. So we went from oral to gastric and then a couple of different intestinal enzymes. And each one of these steps has like volumes of things that you should add to the tube throughout the process. And I was hyper fixated on hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide. And what's interesting about this protocol is there's tick marks under or next to both of those items in this list of other things that we have to add to the tube with the sourdough in it. And in my head, when I heard about pH adjustment, when I read about it in the protocol, I was thinking we have to come up with the volumes of things to add to this tube of hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide. And after I had tried to figure this out in my head, Bo and I had to actually calculate the starting concentration of both of these because we didn't have like a solution of hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide that were the correct molarity to start. We had to make them. So that took like half an hour because I am horrible at math and I wasn't able to communicate with Bo what the end goal was and how my brain was thinking about it because I couldn't quite remember the formulas that we needed. And unfortunately, the hydrochloric acid like starting point was unknown because we just have this giant jar of it from a company, but they didn't put the starting molarity. They just put a percentage that it was titrated with sodium hydroxide and the molecular weight. And I'm sure there's a way to figure out the starting molarity, but I just am not there yet with how to do that. And so we had asked another grad student, we had asked a lab manager from a different lab to help us, and she had a number in her head that she had remembered from some time ago. And she was like, I think it's 12.1, but I don't know why that number sounds familiar. Let me work on it. And then Bo was like, let's just text our mentor and see what's like, if she knows what it is. So throughout that entire process, we were able to get the starting concentration of hydrochloric acid. And then we made our own sodium hydroxide because we couldn't find a bottle of a higher molarity one in the cabinet. And it turns out it was not in a cabinet. It was in a tub on the counter. Anyway, so this protocol that should have started off really simple just got really complicated within like 45 minutes. And I know that there's a lot of troubleshooting that happens when you first look at and try a protocol. I just underestimated how long it would take to even find the starting concentration of a fluid that we have in there. So mild irritation took over and I was starting to get frustrated because it was something that I felt like I should have already known how to do. And that has been a common thread in my entire experience in this first semester of my PhD program. And I had to come back to my mentor in a one-on-one meeting later that day to kind of talk about anything that I needed to talk about. And we ended up getting on the topic of we can't know what we don't know, because I was voicing my frustration and letting her know, and Bo, that I just didn't know what I was doing. And she was like, you're not the only person who has felt this way. And I want this to be reassuring for you because you're not alone. And she was also saying, I don't expect you to get this protocol right the first time. I don't even expect you to get this right the second time, because the more times that you mess things up, the more that you learn and the better you get at whatever thing that you're doing. And she was just really reassuring that it's okay to not know and that there isn't an expectation for me to know. And I countered by saying, I understand that your expectation is not that I need to know all of these things, but I have an unreasonable expectation of myself to have already known what to do because I am a grad student. And I think that for me, I have this idea of what a grad student means based on my experience with other grad students at my previous school and also with others in my program. The only difference here is that I'm in my first semester of my PhD, and many of these people are second year, third year, fifth year PhD students. So they have already had the time to go through this learning pain. And I call it a pain because it's both physical and mentally taxing. Maybe not painful physically, but I'm just going through the largest growing pains I have ever felt. And that day it was starting to weigh on me. So all of this to say, I've had a lot of learning lessons and a lot of reflection this week, and I'm really grateful again. Gratitude is just the common thread through everything. No matter how pissed off I get, no matter how frustrated I feel, I'm always so grateful to be surrounded by so many people who are just supportive and understanding. And it goes beyond my lab or my colleagues. Like the entire department at my school that I am part of has met me with so much acceptance and understanding that even that kind of gets overwhelming a little bit because they just know. And I got a slap in the face reality unrelated to the support from my mentor. And she straight up told me, you need to get comfortable with this feeling of being insecure, of being in a place where you don't know. And she was like, I was told by one of my mentors in my PhD program that the day that you think you know everything, you failed as a scientist. And that hit me real hard because it's true. It's impossible to know everything. And I've interacted with people who are so humble and so understanding and just continue to say, I don't know everything, but this thing I do know, and I'm still learning about because even though I know it, I don't know all of it. And I am just grateful to have that reminder that one, there is not an expectation for me to know anything right now, but also that is the root of progressing in academia is not knowing and learning to know. And I think that's where I'm going to leave you guys this week. I have a lot more reflecting to do. I have a lot more gym going to do and not a lot of questions to answer this week. And by not a lot, I mean 0. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I hope that something that I said today resonated with you. If it did, leave it in the comments down below. And as always, you can find me on Instagram at theleafylentil. And someday I will probably share my fitness Instagram because the goal of this podcast is to integrate my life into it so I can just talk about whatever I want. But right now, the most prominent experience that I'm having is my PhD program. And there's just so much in my head around that bodybuilding and like my physical exercise is like a departure from that, and it gives me a brain break. So someday soon, I will talk to you guys about how I got into bodybuilding and why I'm so inspired by it. But until then, I will keep coming at you with these weekly updates of the life of a PhD student through my perspective as Chelsea Miller. And I will see you again next week. Have a good one.